My thanks to David and Dragan and your wonderful staff, Kim, Kevin, everybody at UCHRI for this conference and this opportunity for me to speak. I'm going to be showing some transparencies, and I thought it would be a nice break for us since we've all been sitting listening. It would be something to focus on. So I'm going to do that for part of my talk, but before I do that, I want to set up some of the assumptions and some of the theoretical work that I think would contextualize what I'm going to show you. In some sense, I think some of the speakers today have already done an enormous amount of work setting up some of the issues that I will be talking about today. Donald's discussion of governmentality is something that is very central to this paper. And the way in which Gil's work talked about visibility and visibility, I want to talk about coming into visibility in that sense. I'm going to sort of push the argument of governmentality in relation to race a little more. And I think that it's important. I find it very productive. And some of the problems of it that Donald has suggested I will also talk about. But some of the productive aspects of Foucault's concept is focus on agency, is focus on subjection in relation to subjectification, the ways in which the logic of governance, the operations of conduct and governance work through the logic of agency and freedom, and the ways in which this is, for me, a somewhat important, and as Nick Rose calls it, a shallow argument, but that I find really useful and productive. Also because what it suggests is that these concepts of race are produced not just by the state, but an assemblage of technologies and discursive practices that produce these. So I'm going to talk about those. I think some of the assumptions of my talk today are the following. For instance, I argue, and these are ideas that many of you are very familiar with, but I'll quickly rehearse them. First, that race exists not just by itself, but in articulation with gender, class, etc. I'm going to talk about it particularly in its articulation with gender today. I would argue that as there are a multiplicity of racial formations that move in and out of visibility, and that's something that's really important, I think, to think about, because these formations change historically and are very mobile, and as Donald's term, polyvalent as well. They're constructed, I think, not in relation to just one nation state, but to a transnational arena. And I'm understanding the transnational as a force field, as a field that's saturated with forms of power that produce a complicated sense of relationships between the domestic and the quote-unquote international, and that complicates that divide as well. I'm also interested in the kinds of looking at the new modes of visibility, using consumer culture and media culture as producing modes of regulation that utilize, at the current juncture, forms of multiculturalism that produce nationalism. I'm interested particularly in American nationalism at the present time, and that the way it is produced is not just from the United States, but from a very diverse set of sites because of its imbrication with consumer culture that is global, with the global media in particular. And so then I also want to claim that consumer culture is as central to the relationship between race and gender, and that embodies and their embodiment, and indeed to the technologies of governmentality that produce freedom, hope, forms of fantasy, for instance, that are to this transnational media culture. And following Ann Stoller's brilliant work, I want to also suggest that we need to look at those spaces that don't seem to be the political sites, what she calls the intimacies of rule, looking at sexuality, etc. But what I want to look at is the feminized spaces of shopping, things that are seemingly trivial and unconnected to geopolitics that I want to suggest are very important today. And in terms of visibility and invisibility in relation to my paper, I just was sitting here most of the day, and suddenly I noticed that there was an American flag there. And this is remarkable because my paper is about the visibility of the American flag. And I want to think about, it sort of occurred to me that there's a way in which the flag moves from being potted plant to center stage in a certain kind of way that I want to think through as a productive moment. So what I'm going to talk about is the emergence of a category, a racial category that moves into visibility from a location of culture, maybe, becomes racial, which one would call people who look Muslim or Middle Eastern and who are Muslim or Middle Eastern. And I want to think of this, the visibility of this, as a new racial category that moves from potted plant to sort of center stage in some kind of way, and does a great deal of work that becomes foregrounded in very important ways after 9/11. So it moves from this realm of culture to race through technologies of racialization and through technologies of visibility that I think are very important here. In general, these technologies of racialization, I think, link up with governmentality because they rely on the concept of risk as a crucial category. And I know Senator Gilman talked about it this morning, too. I want to talk about it in a somewhat different way, because I want to suggest that risk, as it has often been discussed by scholars of governmentality, has been discussed, for instance, in relation to randomness and chance. What I want to suggest is that the construction of categories of people who are at risk or high risk are not just about chance or randomness, but about danger. And so the figure of the criminal, from the criminal to the terrorist, I want to suggest there's the connection of the technology of risk that produces these kinds of figures and racializes them, so that the Muslim Middle Eastern male, for instance, becomes the figure of the terrorist. And there are various modes of racialization that utilize older histories of racialization in the United States, for instance, in a globalized media culture that you can see are being utilized to produce this figure. It's also a very masculine figure, and you can see the way in which the state, for instance, had continued this use of the terrorist as a central figure to suggest that it's not the women who are dangerous, but the men, that they have to sign up, they have to undergo modes of surveillance, that they are a danger not just to people's health, not just to the neighborhood, not just to the community, but to the nation. And that's the central work, I think, that the figure of the terrorist becomes. So the figure of the terrorist, to a certain extent, becomes the extremely dangerous figure, who not because and it is often so dangerous that it cannot even be subject to the due process, the courts of law, or anything else. Those kinds of processes of regulation don't seem even to work in this figure for the most part. I want to also look at this in terms of the wide number of groups of people that this racialized figure encompasses. People from the Africa, the Middle East, all of these sites become pulled together into this one racial figure of one who looks Middle Eastern or Muslim. And I think that that's important also because the ways in which this figure can then function as the figure of the terrorist that is racialized in the United States, but may not be racialized in other parts of the world. In India, for instance, the terrorist is not so racialized. It's a figure of religious difference. It's the Muslim, but it's not a racial figure. But in the United States, the ways in which this figure has been produced in media culture is as a racialized figure. So I want to show you how this kind of racialized, gendered subject becomes a mode of regulation through consumer culture. So let me show you. what was remarkable about 9/11, I thought, was the way in which the grief was supposed to be global. I don't know how many of you experienced the first moments of 9/11, but for many of us, the news came from elsewhere. It came from outside the US because it happened early in the morning, and so on the other side of the world where it was night and people were watching television, they saw it, and they immediately got on the phone and called many of us. No, David's nodding his head. This happened to many people. So in a way, what's interesting about it is that it is a figure of global grief. For instance, Le Monde, the next day, has a headline called "We Are All Americans," which is interesting because what it wants to suggest that we are all united in this struggle against the barbaric figure of the terrorist. So the grief is supposed to be global, and the way that the global grief becomes visible is through its association with the US flag. So this is a headline from the San Francisco Chronicle. What I did was collect all of these images from the powerful, the press, San Francisco Chronicle, the Contra Costa Times, which is part of another whole set of newspapers, and the New York Times. So these are the three newspapers I looked at for a period of a month afterwards and collected all these images. So this was global grief. So the global grief came not only from people individually grieving and talking about how upset they were at this event in the United States all over the world, but also from multinational corporations who said, September 11 will live with us forever. We stand in solidarity. This is the Alliance Group, which is a multinational organization based in Europe and in the United States. Thereafter, there was the New York Marathon. Lots and lots of people from different parts of the world put on the American flag in different guises and showed their allegiance and their solidarity with the United States. And that's something to think about. I think, is very striking how one would not feel solidarity with any other part of the world where this kind of event might happen very often. What is also interesting is the way in which the media commented upon the kinds of solidarity that was forming and the racial formations that were emerging in relation to that, and the ways in which the kinds of positions of different groups in the US were shifting and changing in relation to this event. So my favorite cartoonist, for instance, comments on this, Aaron Magruder, who writes, President Bush invited black leaders to the White House to celebrate Newsweek's announcement that black Americans were no longer the most hated racial ethnic group in America. They fell to third place behind people of Middle Eastern Arab descent and people of East Indian descent because they kind of look like people of Middle Eastern Arab descent. The French and moved to number 4. Very prophetic, too. And the ways in which I call it a form of racialization is that the technologies of visibility that were used to produce this racialized figure. And one thing that was very striking to me as a Sikh was the ways in which the kind of image of the person with turbans was used as a part of this figure, that the Sikh person also was incorporated into this racialized figure. So how was this done? Here's one image that came out, man on train, not linked to assaults. It's an amazing image that it talks about how it's not linked to assault, but that you show the man in the position of a criminal taken off the train. And the Providence police arrest a man who allegedly carried a knife on a Boston to Washington Amtrak train west on Wednesday. This kind of event produced an effect on people in the Sikh community, for instance, was quite evident in the ways they began to regulate themselves. So you have San Francisco Chronicle image saying, Joginder Singh, a Sikh from San Jose, attended a memorial service. He attends with God Bless America on this, written on him. On the Sikh temple, I picked up this. One nation, one sorrow, one Gora. And partly this was because there was a predominant sort of racialized figure of the Sikh also as a terrorist, because he kind of looks like a person of Middle Eastern descent. And so there was, of course, a man in Mesa, Arizona, who was killed, a Sikh man who was killed at a gas station, who was shot right after 9/11 by a man who said, "Kill the ragheads." And that's also a kind of phrase that's used in the U.S. Army to train, when they train people. The Marines have been using this term as they fight in Iraq as well. What was also remarkable, again, back to the shift between the ways in which Americans were being produced out of the hyphenated American in this, at this time. So you have on the one hand the hyphenated American, Japanese, French, Arab, African. On the other side, you see them all becoming Americans. So that this technology produces then a nationalism that is tied to this event and the ways in which race itself is seen to be at once cultural but also contingent, that it can move from one side of the hyphen to the other at this point. However, I would argue to a certain extent that the notion of the American flag does not get completely separated from an affirmation of white supremacy. In images such as these that are juxtaposed, you see this work being done where you see this white male very sort of militaristic, waving the American flag. You see a very subdued Asian man on the bottom here, juxtaposed in these two images, and sort of showing you to a certain extent that that American flag might be draped upon differently racialized bodies, but when it becomes militaristic is in relation to white nationalism. It becomes heterosexualized very, very clearly. Here is one, but it's also racialized. This is an image in the San Francisco Chronicle taken by a Latino photographer about a woman whose name is Maria Costa, but shows, this is after the first baseball game played after 9/11, so it's a very symbolic moment to the nation. Going to war then becomes a matter of consolidating a new American family that can be multicultural as well. So this in the San Francisco Chronicle, and you have this in the West County Times. And the West County Times, more suburban newspaper, so you can see. Another one in the New York Times of the same time is this one, where again, the heterosexual family becomes consolidated in going off to war. As much as these images appeared to be consolidating the American nation in new ways, the flag appeared most strikingly, I think, in ads, on every kind of store, in goods, in advertisements everywhere. And I want to show you some of those. This one, for instance, Saks Fifth Avenue. There are those who I know who will reply that the liberation of humanity, the freedom of man and mind is nothing but a dream. It is the American dream. And the ways in which the American dream brings together consumer culture, forms of freedom, together with a nationalism that can be changing, that can be contingent, that uses race in new ways continually is important, I think, here. Another one is Hot New Deal. Americans Unite, it says. So in your very way in which you can go to Cost Plus World Market, this is from where there are goods from across the country, the world, cheap goods from across the world coming in to provide cheap furniture for your home. Americans can unite in that project of constructing interiority. This one appeared in the New York Times Sunday magazine what makes America beautiful is its diversity. The art and antique centers. Why the flag is connected here is sort of amazing. Why the whole notion of diversity should be attached to the art antique center is sort of makes you wonder what is going on here, because there is no necessary connection between that. California Closets also said, our deepest thoughts and prayers to everyone affected by these tragic events. And this one. The flag also appeared famously in one of the most sort of striking and powerful images of 9/11 in this image atop the wreckage of the World Trade Center. And this became, I saw it in full color in double pages in the New York Times and other important publications, of course, recalling Joe Rosenthal's famous Iwo Jima image from 1945. So the ways in which these ideas, the flag circulated in consumer culture to incorporate multiculturalism, diversity, the kind of mobility of race and nation was, I think, absolutely striking. I want to end with just a quick thought about the ways in which I think multiculturalism then becomes a state project, but also a project of governance, because it's produced by many different people in different communities who are compelled to put on the flag on their bodies, even if they wish to or not, but for whom the flag becomes a mode of being safe. So you could see lots and lots of people in the San Francisco Bay Area where I lived, different kinds of bodies all draped with the flag. And that was another site in which the flag appeared. It sort of draped people's bodies, and it tried to show the ways under the notion of this nation. And it was interesting to me why, I asked in the Sikh community why people were putting on the Sikh flag, and it was predominantly, they argued, to feel safe. They felt that it was necessary to have it on them, though many of them, as recent immigrants, felt they wanted to protect their lives in the US so that they could continue to live here and be safe here. So to a certain extent, the way in which this concept of freedom and self-regulation works, I think it's crucial, and the idea of governmentality and governance allows one to think through the ways in which ideas of freedom, regulation, production of agency can be discussed sort of in these ways, and through the mode of assemblage, the many connections that bring together consumer culture, I think these kinds of new visibilities of race became very powerful after 9/11. Thank you.